this thing has happened with Greek mythology where it's like people know that there's a lot of like depraved things like,
Mhm.
you know, sexual essay and R word stuff and other stuff that's messed up. That people feel like because there is that in a lot of the stories that they don't have to act like a nice person. That they can just say whatever they want. They can trauma porn things out as much as they want. And they don't have to like care about how they affect people because it's like, oh, this is Greek mythology. So you can just do whatever you want. This Reddit post came up of this 16-year-old girl
Mhm.
who wrote a Reddit post talking about how she read Circe and then went into a like intense like depressive episode for like months after she read the book because of how the book affected her. And she talked about how upset she was that all of these horrible things happened to her, that all of the relationships she had that were like meaningful were short lived, and the ones that lasted longer were the more like surface level transactional relationships where they didn't care about each other. And I was like, this sounds familiar. and and saying that like how could she have gone through all of that stuff and then the story is just over, and what am I supposed to do with that? Like that the story, she just went through all this horrific stuff and then the story just ends and I'm supposed to just like move on from that. And especially she was describing the like symptoms she had because she was talking about how she got rid of the book. She didn't even want it in her house anymore. And because it like she just kept thinking about the relationship that Hermes and Circe have in that book. I don't know anything about what that is, but she kept thinking about it a lot and just kept fixating on it. And she described um, symptoms that happen when you're remembering trauma, but you don't know you're remembering trauma. Like she was saying that like she couldn't, she's usually very hygienic and she stopped brushing her teeth and she stopped taking showers and she stopped taking care of herself and she stopped doing all these normal things. She like almost dropped out of school because she failed almost every class she was in when she usually got really good grades. She stopped leaving the house because every time she did she would start having panic attacks. And the way that she got fixated on the relationship of Hermes and Circe, that all of that, I'm like, that is somebody, and I can say that because I actually did this. Like that is somebody that is like remembering, but not knowing that they're remembering something that happened to them that was very upsetting, and they're fixating on fictional characters because it's like you can't get over when fictional characters are doing something that reminds you of something in your life, and you're trying to figure out why it happened to these fictional people because that's your brain of trying to cope about what happened to you in your real life. And so like I was reading that and I was just like, this is and at the very end of all of this, she says, oh, by the way, I'm 16. And I was like, why did a 16-year-old girl read Circe? Like, or like, because she read it because it's a very popular Greek mythology book that a lot of people are talking about. But considering the trigger warnings of that book is like rape and incest, like actively happening on the page and things like that, and like children and babies dying and other things like that, and like rape in like four different ways that I saw in like the trigger warnings. I'm just like, if you're going to make like a big published book like that, a teenager is going to read it, and that teenager went through a gigantic depressive episode for months of her life because she read your book.
Mhm.
Like that should, you should never, people should never be that traumatized by the experience of reading your book. That is
Yeah.
not something that should ever happen. You can talk about these things without making your audience feel like they went through war, because that's what PTSD is, like war.
Especially non-consensually, because as
Yeah.
much as we're talking about trigger warnings, it's not like trigger warnings are written on the books these days.
No. And
Yeah.
it's also one of the things that's hard about trigger warnings too is that when you say like the word, like okay, but like there are a million different ways of how that could be described in
Mhm.
the actual book. And so like take Song of Achilles for example. And one of the trigger warnings was rape. The scene with Patroclus and Diadamia was horrifying in a way that I did not think when there was rape. I thought it was just fetus. I didn't think that in this story that I was going to read like a scene of that much coercion happening in that horrific of a way where the character is literally saying the things that you think when you've been raped, like the exact things that you think when you've been raped. And I was like, that was so much. And like a trigger warning just saying that there's rape in this book or coercion is in this book doesn't really completely like grasp that like sort of thing happening on and like what the scene is like. There's so many different ways that you could write a scene like that. And it's just like that teenage girl shouldn't have been stuck in a depressive episode for months of her life where like her life basically fell apart because she read this book. And like yes, you can't like if all you can think of to say when I talk about this stuff is like, oh, you shouldn't read this if you know about Greek mythology, because you should know before going into it this sort of stuff is in it. And it's like I expect to be treated like a human being.
Mhm.
Like I expect to be treated like a person. People know that people like me exist. We're not like a mirage. Like you're aware. You
You're
know
not just here for arguments about abortion.
no, like we're literally here. We exist. Sometimes we grow up if our parents don't kill us, and that's me. And so, like, it happens, and you know that it happens because you bring us up when you're trying to win arguments with pro life people. And so, if you're going to remember us at any other time, you should also think about us when you're writing these scenes and not just like be like, well, since Greek mythology is horrible with rape, I don't have to like try to think about this sort of stuff with an audience reading it. Like I've told her this for years, but
Mhm.
I've said like people for years have been like, you should write a book about your life. And I was like, how would I ever write a book about my life ethically? Because if anyone would read a book about my life, there's no way that they wouldn't leave like feeling extremely traumatized by it. And I was when I was in my outpatient therapy program in 2019 that like made me stop wanting to die all the time. There was somebody in my program that was very sweet that we had like our own like rooms where we would do like work and stuff like that. Like our therapist would come in there and do like therapy sessions with us every day.
Mhm.
And one of them came into like my room when we were supposed to be doing like other work. And he was like all big eyed, being like, did your dad really never get caught? And he was like so upset and was like kept asking me questions, hoping that I would somehow say that he was somehow caught for something. And because he was just so upset that he got away with everything and like could not imagine how that could have possibly happened to me. And I was still like standing there and talking to him. And so like that's how most people respond to that sort of thing. And I'm like, I'm not willing to do that. I'm not gonna put anything like that out there that makes people that upset because there's no like I don't wanna that's not fair to people. Like traumatizing them doesn't teach them anything. It just makes them get more desensitized to these sort of stories happening.
Yeah.
um, I don't want to add to like that. I don't want to turn myself into a joke in a weird way to like get people's attention short term, but have nothing happen in the long term. I want things to change in the long term.
Yeah.
If I could figure out a way to like talk about that stuff and myself in a way that wouldn't do that to people, I would if it helped like that happening less in the but it was just like no teenager should read your story about Greek mythology and leave it feeling that way. And considering the like trigger warnings for Cersei, it makes a lot of sense that you would feel that way after reading it. And I want to be able to read other adaptations of Greek mythology or just mythology things in general, but it's hard to know like what is okay and what isn't because
Well,
it
I don't like this idea that we have to accept that that has to be in every single story or that it has to be told in a way that we have to think it's okay that there's no consequences in any story. I don't think that that's true. I think people are a little too weird about that for some reason.
yeah, and it's like I guess the thing I'll say is like if you wanted to explore like super dark themes like that, obviously it's understandable why you would want to, but also fan fiction exists.
Yes.
And so you can just write fan fiction for free. A lot of authors do that under like surnames that nobody knows that it's them. Um, but like if you want to explore like really dark themes like that, you don't need to write a Greek mythology novel. You can just write fan fiction and then figure out a way to include it in a story that isn't quite so intense.
Yeah.
There's other options for you than to just do it like I don't know. It's this overall theme that people have that like I don't need to tell anybody details about my life for you to understand that it was bad. Like, do I
Mm-hmm.
need to like give you details about what like the actual ways things happen with my dad for you to know how bad it was? Like, no, that's ridiculous to say. You just know from what I said about it that you don't need to know more. And so, why do you need to read books that give you so much detail about it when they don't need to? You don't, they don't need to. They can do it fine without it.